And welcome again to our weekly discussion on the positivity bias. We are reviewing the eighth chapter, chapter 8 of the book called Positivity Bias by Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson. And tonight's talk is all about Ayin Tov, a good eye. And we'll start off with a quote from the Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar ben Harkanis returned from traveling, and he reported back that I have searched and I have found that the best advice for a person to grow with is to develop an ayin tov, a good eye. And when your lens on life is good, then what you see will be good. You'll be looking for the good and you will find the good. And you'll tend to find positive interpretations for events and for experiences, and judge other people favorably because you develop what's called an ayin tov. One of the things he doesn't mention in the chapter, but it's been talked about in the Talmud, that when we get to the end of our life and we get to the heavenly court, and the tribunal shows us a video of our life's moments, and in that video, though, we don't see ourselves. We don't see that it's us. And we're asked to judge the person in the screen. And we then pronounce judgment upon ourselves. And so the Gemara's advice is learn now how to judge people favorably. It will pay off.
Let me just say this. I would love to believe that I'll be able to judge myself. I often question what is next. What happens when you die?
Yeah. So we want to develop that positivity bias, looking at people favorably, so that when we come to look at our lives, and I don't know about you all, but I've done some things that I could be critical of.
Yeah, well, hard to have an ayin tov toward yourself sometimes. That's
well, and that's part of this. Part of this also is because for us to, the human nature is we find excuses for ourselves. We judge others because we don't see the whole picture. We don't see the background. We don't see what's going on inside. So we tend to judge others not as favorably as we judge ourselves. But even ourselves, we can be pretty critical. And so imagine a world in which the baseline of human interaction is the benefit of the doubt. I remember.
Well, that's in here somewhere.
I remember a couple that went to counseling, and in the counseling, the wife was commenting about her husband. Something would happen, and she would think her husband is going to say this and he's going to say that, and she knows that, because she has these dreams when things will go on, and her husband says this and he says that, and it's just so critical. And the therapist says, but did he say those things? No, but in my dreams he says those things. And the therapist said, you can't judge your husband based on his response in your dreams. You have to judge your husband on his responses in reality. And so ayin tov, to see with a good eye. And I think, before Glasnost, during those years of the communist Soviet regime, when Judaism suffered so terribly, there were many who were ready to give up on the Russian Jews and Jewry in Russia completely, because it was so oppressive and so terrible, that folks just kind of gave up on those things. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe would not do that. The Rebbe's focus was, you could expect people to give up. You could expect under those circumstances for folks to succumb to the pressures, to the threats and everything. But the Rebbe would focus his ayin tov on the exceptions. He would focus on all those people who were Meiser Nefesh, ready to give up their lives, who, establish underground yeshivas and understand underground mikvahs and all types of things to keep up Jewish life, even under extreme secrecy and under penalty of death if discovered. And yet they continued to do so. So do we complain because a rose bush has thorns, or do we celebrate because a thorn bush has roses? You find the good side to focus on, and the Rebbe would always look at the good side of things.
Well, I always looked at the thorns as a defense for those beautiful roses, so they wouldn't just get picked or eaten.
So that's an Ayin Tov. That's a good thing.
Yeah. I had no problem with the thorns.
Are you familiar with the work of the novelist Herman Wouk?
Oh, sure. He served in the Navy, since you asked a couple military guys to help critique your book. So just he was able to maintain his Judaism even, within the Navy, the constraints of that during World War II.
Yeah, yeah. And he wrote some phenomenal novels about the war and everything.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
and he wrote some books about Judaism too.
Yep, yep. And he lived in the last part of his last number of decades. He lived in Palm Springs, and he attended Shabbos programs at the Chabad House of Palm Springs. Rabbi Yonason Denenbein.
That I didn't know.
Yeah, and I remember back in the 80s taking a Shabbaton group to Palm Springs and having seen Herman Wouk there at the Chabad House and having spoken with him on Shabbos a little bit. But Herman Wouk was close to the Rebbe, and he talks about in one of his visits to the Rebbe back in the 1950s, he was bemoaning the lack of Jewish observance and Jewish tradition in America. And again, it's easy to be pessimistic when you look around you and everything is falling apart. But the Rebbe's focus was, again, the Ayin Tov. In the midst of the negative, let's see the positive, right? And the Rebbe's focus was, you've had so much falling apart, but at the same time, the Rebbe's the quote Rabbi Herman Wouk talks about was, given the challenging situation of Jewish education in America, it's amazing that they still observe what they do observe. And it's a very good community within the Jewish community. So, and the beautiful part, what the Rebbe says.
Chapter, I think that Herman Wouk took the Rebbe's advice to heart, because he wrote a book later on, To Be a Jew.
Yes.
Really, it kind of explains Judaism to people that haven't had that education.
Exactly. And so that was in direct response to what the Rebbe told him. He says, well, you cannot tell Americans to do anything. You can teach them to do anything. And again, like as you said, that's his response was to write a book, To Be a Jew, and tremendous work. And it was very popularly used. In fact, I know that a number of people, when converting to Judaism through the proper Orthodox channels, they were told to read that book. That part of the requirement of the course of learning to become Jewish was to read his book. Yeah, very, very nice.
Then answered which locusts were kosher in his book.
That's interesting. Yeah. The other one I thought was interesting was there's a story of the 1960s. There was a young family in Orthodox family in Pittsburgh that was participating in one of the local Orthodox Jewish day schools there. And there was a young student, Yale Butler, who started his writing work. And so he, in order to try and, write something that would draw attention and get some attention, he wrote some provocative stuff. Yeah,
that's a cute story. He's a young boy at the time he writes this.
Exactly. And then, here he is, 12 or 13 years old, and his teacher brings him to the Rebbe, and he realizes that that book is on the Rebbe's desk, so he gets a bit worried. And yet, what the Rebbe said, the Rebbe spoke about a person's obligation to use his talents as a trust from God, meant to be used for the benefit of others. And in that interview, the Rebbe particularly emphasized that a writer should use his abilities to promote Jewish unity and Avos Yisrael, Jewish love one for another.
Well, you
And
didn't even go into why he even gets to talk to the Rebbe, because as a writer he kind of insults the Lubavitch community, but he does it in a funny way, but they saw him for his potential and his writing ability.
yes, that's what the Rebbe focused
Not to
on.
be insulting.
The Rebbe didn't say a word about it. He focused on good writing talents. And later, yeah, no, absolutely. Later on, he becomes one of the publisher of the B'nai B'rith Messenger, and he used to publish the Rebbe's weekly talks on the Parsha there, and focused on Achdus and things like that. And later, he himself became a Rabbi Yale Butler. And there was a time when he was visiting the Rebbe again, and the Rebbe mentioned that he's had such unique writing skills since childhood. The Rebbe remembered that since he was 12, he was writing. So again, the focus on the positive, and by focusing on the positive, actually revealing and bringing out the positive. So I'd love to hear your experiences with this concept.
I want to ask Army neurosurgeon one question. There's one part of this chapter where it says the good news is you can rewire your neurological pathways and shift your patterns of perception to consciously focus on the positive in others. So what do you make of that? Does the brain, can you rewire it?
That's just it's a thought process. So you're thinking, you can retrain your thinking. You can't necessarily retrain other circuits that go other places reflexively.
So that's retrain your thinking. Yeah,
Yeah,
I got
right.
Yeah, because I told you before, I don't have that positive eye because I spent so many 30 years as a police officer, and I was trained to have the evil eye, so to speak, not the Ayin Tov, the good eye, the discerning eye. Look at everybody with a little bit of distrust until you get to know them.
So there's one of the other classes that I'm recording is called the Hasidic Approach to Joy, and in that book, Rabbi Majeski, quoting the Alter Rebbe, quoting the Tanya, Rabbi Majeski talks about in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says when it comes to evil or inappropriate thoughts, to push them away with both hands. And that's what the Alter Rebbe talks about. Push it away with both hands. And Rabbi Majeski gives a wonderful mashal, a wonderful example of what that means, to push it with both hands. And he gives the example of someone comes to your door, and you know him. He's a nudge, and there's a Yiddish term called "dreh kop," which literally means to me drag my head, right?
Yeah,
right. So you have a choice. The guy comes to the door, and you can invite him in, and you can serve him refreshments, and you can bet he will be back again and again. So the time you entertain him and the refreshments you give him, you are training him to come back and visit again. Or you could go to the door, and you could stand in the doorway and yell and shout at him about, I don't like you. I don't want to hear from you. You're a waste of my time. You're dreh kop. Go away. I don't want to hear from you. And you could sit there but effectively, you're still giving him attention. And there are people who are so desperate for attention, they'll take negative attention just to get attention. And so that thought will be back. That person will be back to get some attention. A third way to push it away would be, don't answer the door. Don't even respond. Now, it's really hard to not respond to someone banging at your door, especially if he continues banging at your door.
Well, you don't know if they're in trouble or not. That's
Yes, in this
you don't
motion,
wanna-
you
you don't wanna
wouldn't know if
ignore
they're,
someone who's
but
in
but
trouble.
let's say you took a peek and you saw who's there, right? So you decide that if you don't answer the door, he may come back, but the longer you practice not answering the door, eventually he'll give up. And it's hard to ignore the banging at the door, but if you engage yourself in something else that's entertaining, that catches your attention, if you train yourself to think of something else, then you can focus on the other thing until the nudge quits coming to the door. The same way with thoughts. The more we entertain the thought, a negative thought or an inappropriate thought, or just something that's coming to a thought that comes to disturb us, a fearful thought, the more we entertain it, then the more frequent it will return.
Mind you, I would tell you that a discerning eye served me well for 30 years.
Yeah. So the question becomes, a discerning eye, a proper, true discerning eye doesn't have to dwell on the subject.
I see what you're saying with that. Yes, I would have to say you're right. I agree. Yes.
And we do want to teach
Hopefully
people,
make some decisions there.
right? We do want to teach people, situational awareness. It's a critical in our day and age to be, have situational awareness and have that critical eye. But that doesn't mean one has to dwell on the negative.
And Zev and I, having been military, of course, we're used to thinking about the enemy. And even though the enemy is not necessarily bad, they are going to kill us.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have to have the discerning eye. You have to have, you have to be careful of that, but we don't have to dwell on negative things, and we can make a choice. Right. And so, how many times you have prisoners of war who chose to focus on positive things and potentials for the future, as opposed to focusing on the negative and we'll never get out of here. And
Actually,
so
I was on the other side of the fence. I did the prisoner of war duty in Desert Storm. It was our first mission, well, second mission actually. And we didn't look at the Iraqis as total scum. We looked at them as people. And when we did that, we for the most part had a nice working relationship with about 95% of the prisoners of war, with the exception of the Republican Guard, who were true believers. That's where that discerning eye came in. But
right.
these people were more than willing to help themselves and made our lives easier because we treated them like people.
So the Ayin Tov, you saw them as human beings.
Yeah, not the enemy. Yeah, right.
Exactly. Very positive thing. And so it's a choice we're making. And if we train ourselves consistently to be focusing on the positive, then we can start to see the positive, and we can see it more readily and more often by focusing on those type of things.
Nowadays with anti-Semitism and violent acts against Jews, you really you have to kind of keep both eyes open, even though you want to regard everyone in a positive light.
Right.
You always have to be somewhat suspicious of someone's motives, to a point.
Right.
And
you have to be discerning.
Even to this day, when I'm sitting in, if I go to a restaurant, I want to be able to see the door. I'm never going to have my back to the door.
Right.
Well, aren't you just a police officer?
No, and even when I'm in shul, I'm on the back row, so I could see the entire shul, and I could see out the door.
My job. You're the security chairman. Okay.
Well, actually, I'm on the security team of the shul, but I sit on and I watch, and I'm able to, from my position, I'm able to see the door, and I'm able to see the entire shul.
And I do the same thing, but I don't sit. I stand up at the front of the shul, because the entrance comes through that area. And so I have my, except when, the parts of the davening where you're supposed to face Mizrach, to face east, typically I'm watching the crowd and I'm watching the door. Recently, we had someone coming that our security guard did not recognize. And as soon as I saw that he had stopped someone at the door, I moved up forward and, talked to the guy and asked some pleasant questions and where you're from and what brings you here and can you show me everything in your pockets? It doesn't mean I don't have an Ayin Tov. It doesn't mean I'm not judging your faith, but I am discerning and I want to be sure.
Shouldn't take too long to figure out if they're Jewish.
Right. Well, that was obvious. And his Russian accent was obvious. Right. But still, you want to be cautious. So yeah, we absolutely have to be in a situational awareness at all times, very important. But at the same time, the Ayin Tov to be, favoring judgmental. I think the Ayin Tov really comes in most often in relationships. You're starting to get to know someone, and when something happens, if something happens between friends, usually we judge our person favorably because we know them a little bit, right? It's that when you don't quite know how to judge a person, we have a choice to judge favorably and find that, to seek the good, find the good.
I think the chapter mentions the fact that we tend to be judgmental based on some of these past relationships.
Right.
Don't always look at each engagement as a fresh one.
Right. So as long as we have positive experiences, we don't have to be so judgmental of people. But if we grow up in an environment where we're constantly being judged, then we learn to be judgmental of others. Want to get your thoughts on this picture. I'm going to share this one. What were your thoughts on this picture?
Yeah. Let me tell you something. I couldn't find the old woman for a long time.
That means you have an Ayin Tov. That means that you tend to focus on positive things. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Zev, how about you?
I mean, the only thing I see is a woman, the back of a woman's head, and a hat and a coat. I don't even know what the.
Oh no! You can if you.
So you don't see. See, you're so good.
To the right a little bit. Now you can see the older woman, but at first you see the young woman, and it's
no. All I see is I still don't see the older woman.
Okay, so watch. I'm going to point out the older woman now because you have such an Ayin Tov, a good eye. You can't even see it. That's a good thing, right? This is her mouth with her lips. This is the curvature of her nose. This is her left eye and the eyelash of her right eye, but she's turned just a bit. There's the hair coming out underneath her hat and the wavy cap or the wavy, I want to say tichel of her hat. This is her fur coat. This is the chin that juts out.
Rabbi, when you're 60 some odd years old, the old woman doesn't seem too bad either.
Good for you. Good for you. Now, what do you think about the exercise, though?
Yeah, makes me feel like I'm a dirty old man.
I think it's an interesting exercise. Is that and all of us saw the good. Initially we saw the young lady, but
I'd like to see what women see.
Interestingly enough, I think statistics show it's very similar.
Really,
it's very similar, yeah. And I think it's do we see the beautiful or do we see in this expression they talk about the old hag, but she doesn't look so bad, yeah. But anyway, but still, the one who's smiling and debonair and happy, or the one who's
the first thing I saw was the gorgeous young woman.
Yeah. And I saw, again, it comes back to, you know, what we're taught to see, and you know, the Ayin Tov part is if we develop a good eye, we'll see it more often. And as we talked about in the beginning of the class, it's to our benefit. Not only, you know, when we called our judgment day to judge ourselves, but I think generally speaking, it just makes us happier because you're always looking at good things. You're always looking at happy things. My mother, she has a discerning eye, but she definitely tends to also see the positive in people and positive things. And we were laughing the other day because she said, this was before the COVID situation and the pandemic, but my mom, for years, she can't get out of a grocery line without meeting somebody new and making a friend. You know, she's just such a positive attitude. She's just always meeting and greeting and making new friends, and it's just so easy. It's part of who she is. But it's a wonderful thing. Adds joy to our lives, right?
I tell you, I miss the interaction with people. I don't know, you know, whenever somebody might review this, thinking back about COVID, I hope things improve again.
Yeah.
I have every hope for this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
My first inoculation, I'll probably beat you to the second one because you have to wait for another month.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So stick around for a minute. I'm going to sign off for the class and thank everyone for joining us. And for those who are watching the recordings, thank you for joining us as well. And we'll talk more about the next chapter will be not only the Ayin Tov, but Lashon Tov, to be able to actually take it from thought patterns to actually speech patterns as well.